Behind the gilded doors of royal palaces, and within the shadowed corners of isolated communities, a practice has persisted throughout human history that challenges our very understanding of family, power, and survival. Today, we're diving into one of humanity's most disturbing and complex phenomena, sibling inbreeding. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view some of history's most powerful dynasties and shed light on genetic realities that continue to impact communities worldwide. The year was 1649, and in the opulent chambers of the Spanish royal court, a child was born who would become living proof of nature's unforgiving response to genetic manipulation. Charles II of Spain entered this world as the product of generations of brothers marrying sisters, uncles wedding nieces, and cousins binding themselves in matrimony to preserve what they believed was the purity of royal blood. What they created instead was a walking testament to genetic catastrophe. But Charles was not alone in history's gallery of inbreeding's victims. From the sun-baked temples of ancient Egypt, where pharaohs routinely married their sisters, to remote islands where geography itself forced families into impossible choices, the practice of sibling unions has left an indelible mark on human civilization. The question that haunts us today is not merely why this happened, but what the true cost has been, and continues to be. The reality is far more horrifying than most people imagine. When siblings reproduce, they're essentially playing genetic roulette with a loaded gun. Every human carries recessive genes, hidden genetic time bombs that remain dormant when paired with healthy dominant genes from unrelated partners. But when brothers and sisters create offspring together, these recessive genes meet their dangerous twins, unleashing a cascade of genetic disorders that can destroy bodies, minds, and entire bloodlines. Consider the mathematics of genetic disaster. When unrelated individuals have children, the chance of serious genetic abnormalities hovers around 2 to 3%. When siblings reproduce, that number skyrockets to between 25 and 50%. We're not talking about minor health issues. We're discussing catastrophic deformities, severe mental disabilities, and conditions so devastating that they defy medical understanding. The ancient Egyptians, masters of engineering and astronomy, somehow convinced themselves they could outsmart nature itself. For over 3,000 years, pharaonic dynasties practiced sibling marriage as a religious duty, believing they were emulating the gods Isis and Osiris. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, took this practice to its logical extreme. Cleopatra VII, perhaps history's most famous Egyptian queen, was herself the product of at least 8 generations of sibling marriages. But the Egyptians paid a terrible price for their genetic hubris. Modern analysis of royal mummies reveals a catalogue of horrors that would make contemporary medical professionals shudder. Severe skeletal deformities, premature deaths, and mysterious ailments plagued the pharaonic bloodlines. King Tutankhamun, the boy king whose golden mask captivates museum visitors worldwide, suffered from a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and numerous other genetic abnormalities that made his short life a testament to suffering. The genetic evidence tells an even more disturbing story. When researchers analyzed Tutankhamun's DNA, they discovered that his parents were full siblings, brother and sister who created a child destined for a life of pain and an early death at just 19 years old. His body bore the unmistakable signatures of inbreeding depression, a phenomenon where the accumulation of harmful recessive genes creates a cascade of health problems that compound with each generation. Moving forward through time, we encounter the Habsburg dynasty of Europe, whose approach to sibling marriage created one of history's most visible examples of genetic degradation. While not always practicing direct sibling unions, their commitment to keeping marriages within the immediate family created a genetic bottleneck that produced the infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe underbite so pronounced that affected individuals could barely chew food or speak clearly. Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg king, represents the ultimate endpoint of this genetic experiment. His family tree was so tangled with inbreeding that his coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of genetic similarity between parents, was higher than that of children born to siblings. The result was a man so physically and mentally compromised that contemporaries described him as barely human. He suffered from severe mental disabilities, was unable to walk until age 4, couldn't speak until age 8, and despite 2 marriages, proved incapable of producing an heir. But the horror of sibling inbreeding extends far beyond royal palaces. In isolated communities around the world, geographic barriers have sometimes forced families into genetic corners where sibling marriage becomes a desperate survival strategy. The remote island of Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic Ocean provides a stark example of how isolation can lead to genetic catastrophe. Settled by a handful of families in the early 19th century, Tristan da Cunha's population grew from these limited genetic founders. Over generations, the inevitable result was increasing levels of inbreeding, including some sibling unions born of necessity rather than choice. The consequences have been devastating. The island's population suffers from an unusually high rate of genetic disorders, including a form of progressive blindness that affects a significant percentage of residents. The medical reality of sibling reproduction involves more than simple genetic mathematics. When siblings conceive children together, they're creating what geneticists call a genetic founder effect in miniature. Every harmful recessive gene that exists in their shared family line has a 25% chance of appearing in their offspring. This means that rare genetic disorders that might appear in 1 in 10,000 births in the general population suddenly become common occurrences. The range of potential genetic disasters is staggering. Metabolic disorders that prevent children from processing basic nutrients, neurological conditions that cause progressive brain deterioration, immune system deficiencies that leave individuals vulnerable to infections that would be minor inconveniences for others, skeletal malformations that create lives of constant pain. The list reads like a catalogue of human suffering. Perhaps most disturbing is the phenomenon of genetic anticipation, where genetic disorders become more severe with each generation of inbreeding. What begins as mild symptoms in the parents can manifest as life-threatening conditions in their children. This creates a downward spiral where each generation becomes less viable than the last, ultimately leading to the extinction of the bloodline, nature's harsh but effective method of eliminating genetic dead ends. Modern genetic science has revealed that the human genome contains an estimated 12,000 to 15,000 genes that can cause serious disorders when present in 2 copies. In normal reproduction between unrelated individuals, the chances of both parents carrying the same harmful recessive gene are relatively small. But when siblings reproduce, they share approximately 50% of their genes, meaning the probability of harmful genetic combinations increases exponentially. The psychological dimension of sibling inbreeding adds another layer of complexity to this already disturbing phenomenon. Historical records suggest that many sibling couples who engaged in reproductive relationships suffered from severe psychological stress, even in cultures where such unions were officially sanctioned. The burden of knowing that their children faced increased risks of genetic disorders, combined with social stigma and family dysfunction, created psychological pressures that often proved unbearable. Religious and cultural justifications for sibling marriage have varied throughout history, but they all share common themes of purity, divine sanction, and the preservation of special bloodlines. The ancient Egyptians believed that royal siblings were literally divine beings, whose genetic purity must be maintained to preserve their connection to the gods. European royalty convinced themselves that noble blood was fundamentally different from common blood and must be preserved through careful breeding practices. These beliefs, while understandable within their historical contexts, represent fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of genetics and human reproduction. There is no such thing as genetically superior bloodlines in the sense that these cultures imagined. In fact, genetic diversity is one of humanity's greatest strengths, providing resilience against diseases and environmental challenges that would devastate more genetically uniform populations. The historical evidence also reveals that sibling inbreeding was often accompanied by elaborate systems of secrecy and denial. Royal physicians learned to describe genetic abnormalities in euphemistic terms that obscured their true causes. Court records were carefully edited to minimize references to the health problems that plagued inbred dynasties. Artists were commissioned to create idealized portraits that concealed the physical deformities caused by generations of genetic mismanagement. This systematic cover-up has made it difficult for modern researchers to fully understand the scope of genetic damage caused by historical inbreeding practices. However, advances in DNA analysis and forensic archaeology are beginning to reveal the true extent of the genetic catastrophes hidden within royal tombs and burial sites. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how profoundly inbreeding has shaped human history and continues to impact isolated populations today. The story of sibling inbreeding is ultimately a story about the tension between human ambition and natural law. Throughout history, powerful families have attempted to control inheritance, preserve wealth, and maintain political power through strategic marriages. When these strategies involved sibling unions, the results were invariably tragic, demonstrating that nature's laws cannot be safely violated, regardless of political or religious justifications. The consequences of these genetic catastrophes extended far beyond individual suffering. Entire dynasties collapsed under the weight of their own biological contradictions. The Spanish Habsburg line, once the most powerful royal house in Europe, effectively ended with Charles II's death in 1700. His inability to produce an heir triggered the War of Spanish Succession, reshaping the political landscape of an entire continent. What began as an attempt to preserve power through genetic purity ultimately destroyed the very thing it sought to protect. But the horror deepens when we examine the lived experiences of those trapped within these genetic nightmares. Court records, when they can be found and deciphered, paint pictures of profound suffering that official histories worked desperately to conceal. Children who never learned to walk properly, their bones twisted by genetic disorders that modern medicine barely understands. Adults whose immune systems were so compromised that minor illnesses became death sentences. Mental deterioration so severe that royal family members became prisoners in their own palaces, hidden from public view to preserve the illusion of dynastic strength. The medical examinations of royal remains have revealed evidence of conditions that would challenge even contemporary physicians. Bone analysis shows patterns of malformation consistent with severe genetic disorders. Dental records revealed developmental abnormalities that would have made eating a constant struggle. Skull measurements indicate brain malformations that would have profoundly impacted cognitive function and quality of life. Consider the psychological torment experienced by parents who watch their children suffer from conditions they had unknowingly created. Historical accounts, buried in private correspondence and coded diary entries, hint at the devastating guilt experienced by royal parents who began to understand the connection between their family's marriage practices and their children's suffering. Some turned to increasingly desperate medical interventions, subjecting their offspring to primitive treatments that often caused more harm than the original conditions. The ripple effects of sibling inbreeding extended into the political realm in ways that shaped the course of nations. Weak kings and queens, compromised by genetic disorders, became puppet rulers manipulated by ambitious courtiers. Military campaigns failed because commanders were mentally incapable of making strategic decisions. Economic policies suffered because rulers lacked the cognitive capacity to understand complex financial systems. The genetic degradation of ruling classes created power vacuums that opportunistic nobles and foreign powers were quick to exploit. The social implications were equally profound. As royal bloodlines became increasingly compromised, the very concept of divine right monarchy began to lose credibility. How could kings claim to rule by God's will when their own bodies provided such obvious evidence of divine displeasure. The visible genetic failures of inbred dynasties contributed to growing popular skepticism about hereditary rule, helping to fuel the political revolutions that would eventually sweep away many European monarchies. In isolated communities where sibling marriage occurred out of necessity rather than choice, the psychological burden was different but equally devastating. Families faced impossible decisions between genetic disaster and cultural extinction. Some communities developed elaborate systems of arranged marriages designed to minimize inbreeding while preserving cultural identity. Others simply accepted genetic decline as the price of survival, watching helplessly as each generation became weaker than the last. The role of medical practitioners in these scenarios reveals another disturbing dimension of the inbreeding tragedy. Court physicians often understood the connection between family marriage patterns and genetic disorders, but their positions depended on royal favor. Speaking truth to power about genetic consequences could result in exile or execution. Many chose to remain silent, prescribing ineffective treatments while watching their patients suffer from conditions they knew could have been prevented. Some medical records from this period survive, written in coded language that disguise the true nature of genetic disorders. Physicians described melancholy of the blood instead of depression caused by neurological damage. They referred to divine afflictions rather than acknowledging genetic deformities. This systematic obfuscation has made it difficult for modern researchers to fully understand the scope of genetic damage caused by historical inbreeding practices. The development of more sophisticated medical understanding gradually revealed the true horror of what had been happening. As physicians began to understand basic principles of heredity, they started to recognize patterns connecting family marriage practices to genetic disorders. This knowledge remained largely confined to medical circles, as political and religious authorities had powerful incentives to suppress information that undermined their legitimacy. The genetic legacy of historical inbreeding continues to impact populations today. DNA analysis has revealed that certain genetic disorders remain unusually common in populations descended from historically inbred communities. These genetic signatures, embedded in chromosomes, serve as permanent reminders of choices made centuries ago by ancestors who could not have understood the full consequences of their actions. Modern genetic counseling has transformed our understanding of reproductive risks, but isolated populations still struggle with the consequences of their genetic heritage. Some communities have implemented sophisticated genetic screening programs to identify carriers of harmful recessive genes. Others have developed cultural practices designed to encourage marriage outside their traditional boundaries, slowly expanding their genetic diversity over generations. The study of historical inbreeding has also provided valuable insights into human genetic resilience. Researchers have discovered that some populations developed partial resistance to certain genetic disorders through natural selection processes that eliminated the most severely affected individuals. This harsh form of genetic editing demonstrates nature's ruthless efficiency in dealing with genetic dead ends. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal new examples of the devastating effects of sibling inbreeding. Burial sites from various cultures show skeletal remains bearing unmistakable signs of genetic disorders. Teeth that never developed properly, bones that grew in twisted patterns, skulls that show evidence of severe neurological abnormalities. Each discovery adds to our understanding of how profoundly inbreeding has shaped human history. The emotional cost of sibling inbreeding extended beyond immediate families to entire communities. Servants, courtiers, and common people who witnessed the suffering of inbred royal families often developed deep skepticism about hereditary authority. Folktales and legends from various cultures contained coded references to the genetic failures of ruling classes, suggesting that common people understood far more about the consequences of inbreeding than official histories acknowledged. Religious institutions faced complex challenges when confronting inbreeding practices. While many faiths officially prohibited marriages between close relatives, political pressures from powerful families often forced religious leaders to provide exceptions or look the other way. Some religious authorities developed elaborate theological justifications for sibling marriage, arguing that divine bloodlines operated according to different rules than those governing ordinary humans. The artistic record provides another window into the reality of inbreeding's effects. Careful analysis of royal portraits often reveals attempts to conceal or minimize genetic abnormalities through artistic techniques. Painters learn to position subjects to hide deformities, use lighting to mask skin conditions, and employ symbolic elements to distract viewers from obvious physical problems. The gap between idealized artistic representations and the documented medical reality of these individuals provides stark evidence of systematic deception about genetic consequences. Economic records from inbred dynasties show patterns of increasing dysfunction that mirror their genetic decline. As rulers became less capable of governing effectively, state finances deteriorated, military effectiveness declined, and administrative systems broke down. The correlation between genetic degradation and political collapse suggests that the practice of sibling inbreeding may have contributed to the fall of several major civilizations throughout history. The preservation of genetic evidence from historical periods has allowed modern scientists to reconstruct family trees with unprecedented accuracy. DNA analysis of royal remains has confirmed relationships that historical records obscured or denied entirely. These genetic genealogies reveal the true extent of inbreeding within various dynasties, often showing patterns far more extreme than contemporary documents suggested. The development of population genetics as a scientific discipline has provided new frameworks for understanding the long-term consequences of inbreeding. Mathematical models can now predict how genetic diversity declines over generations of close relative marriages and how long it takes for populations to recover genetic health through outbreeding. These models have proven remarkably accurate when applied to historical populations where detailed records exist. Contemporary isolated communities continue to grapple with the genetic legacy of historical inbreeding practices. Some have implemented innovative solutions, such as genetic matchmaking programs that use DNA analysis to optimize marriages for genetic diversity. Others have established cultural exchange programs designed to encourage marriage outside their traditional communities, slowly reversing centuries of genetic isolation. The psychological impact on individuals who discover they are products of sibling relationships remains profound in modern contexts. Genetic testing increasingly reveals hidden family relationships that previous generations kept secret. The emotional trauma of learning about genetic risks, combined with social stigma and family shame, creates complex psychological challenges that require specialized counseling and support systems. The medical establishment's complicity in concealing these genetic horrors runs deeper than mere professional discretion. Across centuries and cultures, physicians developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms designed to mask the reality of inbreeding's consequences. Court doctors spoke of melancholic humors when describing severe depression caused by neurological damage. They referenced divine afflictions rather than acknowledging the grotesque deformities that marked generation after generation of genetically compromised royal children. These medical practitioners found themselves trapped in an impossible position. Speaking truthfully about genetic consequences meant risking their positions, their wealth, and often their lives. Remaining silent meant becoming complicit in a system that perpetuated unimaginable suffering. Many chose the path of professional survival, developing increasingly elaborate treatments that they knew were useless while watching their patients deteriorate from conditions that could have been prevented through simple genetic diversity. The surviving medical texts from these periods read like exercises in creative deception. One 17th century Spanish court physician described the young prince's inability to walk as an excess of noble humors settling in the lower extremities. Modern medical analysis of the same prince's remains reveals severe skeletal malformations consistent with multiple genetic disorders. The physician's flowery language could not disguise the reality that the child was suffering from conditions that made normal locomotion impossible. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these historical records lies in what they don't say. Gaps in medical documentation often coincide with periods when genetic problems became too severe to hide or euphemize. Entire months or years of royal health records simply vanish from historical archives, suggesting systematic destruction of evidence that would have revealed the true scope of genetic catastrophe within these families. The psychological warfare waged against reality extended beyond medical practitioners to encompass entire court systems. Artists were commissioned to create portraits that bore little resemblance to their subjects' actual appearance. The famous portraits of Charles II of Spain show a relatively normal-looking monarch, yet contemporary written descriptions paint a picture of a man so physically compromised that foreign ambassadors struggled to hide their shock upon meeting him in person. These artistic deceptions served a crucial political function, but they also created profound psychological stress for the subjects themselves. Imagine living your entire life knowing that your public image was a carefully constructed lie, that your real appearance was considered too disturbing for public consumption. Royal family members often became prisoners in their own palaces, hidden from view whenever their genetic abnormalities became too obvious to conceal through makeup and clever positioning. The development of photography in the 19th century created new challenges for families struggling to hide genetic consequences. Some of the earliest royal photographs reveal shocking disparities between artistic representations and photographic reality. The camera's unforgiving lens captured details that artists had spent centuries learning to obscure or omit entirely. The genetic time bombs embedded within these bloodlines often took generations to fully manifest. A seemingly healthy royal couple might produce children with minor abnormalities that appeared manageable. But as these children grew up and married their own siblings or close cousins, the genetic damage compounded exponentially. What began as barely noticeable quirks evolved into devastating disabilities that destroyed lives and ended dynasties. Consider the mathematical progression of genetic disaster across generations. First-generation sibling offspring might show subtle signs of inbreeding depression, slightly lower intelligence, minor physical abnormalities, increased susceptibility to illness. Second-generation individuals, products of another round of close relative marriages, displayed more obvious problems: severe learning disabilities, visible deformities, chronic health conditions. By the third or fourth generation, the genetic load had become so overwhelming that survival to adulthood became increasingly rare. The emotional toll on families watching this genetic deterioration unfold was catastrophic. Private letters and diary entries, when they survive, reveal parents consumed by guilt and desperation as they watch their children suffer from conditions they had unknowingly created. Some turn to increasingly extreme religious practices, convinced that divine intervention might reverse what they were beginning to understand was genetic destiny. The social implications rippled outward from royal families into the broader populations they governed. Common people, while not understanding the genetic mechanisms involved, could observe the obvious decline in their rulers' capabilities. Whispered conversations in marketplaces and taverns spread knowledge that official sources worked desperately to suppress. Folktales from various cultures contain surprisingly accurate descriptions of genetic disorders, suggesting that popular understanding of inbreeding's consequences was more sophisticated than authorities realized. The development of more systematic record-keeping inadvertently created detailed documentation of genetic decline. Administrative documents tracking royal births, deaths, and health problems provide modern researchers with unprecedented insight into the progression of genetic disorders across generations. These bureaucratic records, originally intended for administrative purposes, now serve as genetic case studies that reveal patterns invisible to contemporary observers. Religious institutions faced increasingly complex theological challenges as genetic consequences became more apparent. How could divine bloodlines be reconciled with obvious genetic failure? Some religious leaders developed elaborate doctrines suggesting that physical suffering was a test of spiritual purity, allowing them to maintain theological support for inbreeding while acknowledging its devastating effects. Others quietly began discouraging close relative marriages while publicly maintaining support for traditional practices. The economic consequences of genetic decline created feedback loops that accelerated dynastic collapse. As rulers became less capable of effective governance, state resources were increasingly diverted to medical care and attempts to conceal royal disabilities. Court budgets swelled with payments to physicians, artists, and servants sworn to secrecy about genetic conditions. Military effectiveness declined as genetically compromised leaders proved incapable of making strategic decisions or inspiring troops. The preservation of genetic evidence in burial sites has allowed modern scientists to reconstruct the true scope of historical inbreeding with startling accuracy. DNA analysis of royal remains reveals family relationships that contemporary records deliberately obscured. These genetic genealogies show patterns of inbreeding far more extensive than historical documents suggested, indicating systematic deception about family marriage practices. Archaeological excavations continue to uncover evidence of genetic disasters hidden by historical cover-ups. Burial sites reveal individuals with skeletal abnormalities so severe that survival to adulthood would have required constant medical care. The presence of specialized burial goods and elaborate tomb constructions suggests that these individuals held high social status despite their obvious genetic problems, indicating that royal families continued to honor genetically compromised members while hiding their conditions from public view. The psychological impact on surviving family members who witnessed these genetic catastrophes created lasting trauma that affected subsequent generations. Even when families finally abandoned inbreeding practices, the memory of genetic disasters influenced their reproductive choices for centuries. Some royal houses developed elaborate genealogical research programs designed to identify and avoid genetic risks, essentially creating primitive forms of genetic counseling. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that certain populations still carry elevated frequencies of rare genetic disorders traceable to historical inbreeding practices. These genetic signatures serve as permanent reminders of choices made centuries ago by ancestors who could not have understood the full consequences of their reproductive decisions. Contemporary genetic counselors working with these populations must navigate complex cultural sensitivities while providing medically necessary information about genetic risks. The study of inbreeding's historical consequences has also provided valuable insights into human genetic resilience and adaptation. Some populations developed partial resistance to certain genetic disorders through natural selection processes that eliminated the most severely affected individuals. This harsh form of genetic editing demonstrates nature's ruthless efficiency in dealing with genetic dead ends, while revealing the remarkable adaptability of human populations under extreme selective pressure. The documentation of sibling inbreeding's effects has contributed significantly to modern understanding of genetic disease mechanisms. Historical examples provide natural experiments that would be impossible to replicate ethically in controlled research settings. These cases have helped scientists understand how genetic disorders progress across generations and how populations recover from genetic bottlenecks. The emotional legacy of these genetic disasters extends beyond immediate families to entire cultures. Societies that practiced extensive inbreeding often develop deep-seated anxieties about heredity and bloodlines that persist in modified forms today. Cultural taboos surrounding discussions of genetic health, family planning, and reproductive choices can often be traced back to historical experiences with inbreeding's devastating consequences. The artistic and literary record provides additional evidence of inbreeding's psychological impact on historical societies. Coded references to genetic disorders appear in folk tales, religious texts, and artistic works from cultures that practice sibling marriage. These cultural artifacts suggest that popular understanding of inbreeding's consequences was more sophisticated than official histories acknowledged, and that common people developed their own explanations for the genetic disasters they witnessed among their rulers. Contemporary researchers continue to discover new evidence of historical inbreeding's scope and consequences. Advances in DNA analysis technology allow scientists to extract genetic information from increasingly degraded remains, expanding our understanding of genetic relationships within historical populations. Each new discovery adds to the growing body of evidence documenting the catastrophic consequences of sibling reproduction throughout human history. The intersection of genetic science and historical research has created entirely new fields of study dedicated to understanding the role of inbreeding in shaping human civilization. Population geneticists work alongside historians and archaeologists to reconstruct the genetic history of various cultures and identify the long-term consequences of reproductive isolation and close relative marriages. The prevention strategies developed in response to historical inbreeding disasters have evolved into sophisticated genetic screening programs that protect modern populations from similar genetic catastrophes. These programs represent humanity's attempt to learn from the genetic mistakes of the past, while preserving cultural diversity and individual reproductive choice. The legacy of these genetic catastrophes extends far beyond the confines of royal palaces and into the darkest corners of human biology itself. What modern science has revealed about the mechanisms behind sibling inbreeding is perhaps more terrifying than the historical accounts themselves. When we peer into the genetic machinery that governs human reproduction, we discover that nature has built-in safeguards specifically designed to prevent the kind of genetic disasters that result from sibling unions. The violation of these biological laws creates a cascade of molecular chaos that can persist for generations. Deep within every human cell lies a complex system of genetic repair mechanisms that work tirelessly to maintain the integrity of our DNA. These molecular guardians can correct many types of genetic damage, but they become overwhelmed when faced with the double dose of identical harmful genes that result from sibling reproduction. It's as if the cell's quality control systems recognize that something fundamentally wrong is happening and begin to malfunction themselves, creating additional layers of genetic instability. The most insidious aspect of sibling inbreeding lies in its ability to unmask recessive lethal genes that would otherwise remain safely hidden in the human genome. Every person carries between 5 and 10 genes that would be fatal if present in 2 copies. In normal reproduction between unrelated individuals, the chances of both parents carrying the same lethal gene are vanishingly small. But when siblings reproduce, these hidden genetic time bombs have a 25% chance of combining with devastating results. Consider the horrifying reality of what this means in practical terms. A sibling couple might appear perfectly healthy themselves, showing no outward signs of genetic problems. Yet hidden within their shared DNA lies a collection of recessive genes that, when combined in their offspring, can create conditions so severe that they challenge our understanding of human survival. Some of these genetic combinations are so lethal that affected embryos cannot survive to birth. Others allow survival, but condemn the child to a life of unimaginable suffering. The range of genetic disorders that become common in inbred populations reads like a catalogue of human misery. Metabolic conditions that prevent the body from processing basic nutrients, causing affected children to slowly starve despite adequate nutrition. Neurological disorders that cause progressive brain degeneration, stealing away cognitive function and personality over years of inexorable decline. Immune system deficiencies that leave individuals defenseless against infections that healthy people easily overcome. But perhaps most disturbing are the genetic conditions that affect the development of the nervous system itself. When siblings reproduce, they dramatically increase the risk of creating children with severe neural tube defects, conditions where the brain and spinal cord fail to develop properly during embryonic growth. These developmental disasters can result in children born without functional brains or with spinal cords that terminate abruptly, leaving them paralyzed from birth. The psychological dimension of these genetic catastrophes extends beyond the immediate suffering of affected individuals to encompass entire family systems. Parents who discover that their sibling relationship has condemned their children to genetic disaster often experience psychological trauma so severe that it destroys their ability to function in daily life. The guilt of knowing that their choices directly cause their children's suffering creates a form of mental anguish that conventional therapy struggles to address. Historical records, when they can be deciphered through the layers of euphemism and deliberate obfuscation, reveal families torn apart by the realization that their reproductive choices had created genetic nightmares. Some parents became obsessed with finding medical cures for conditions that were fundamentally genetic in nature, spending fortunes on quack treatments and experimental procedures that often caused more harm than the original conditions. The social dynamics within families practicing sibling inbreeding created additional layers of psychological complexity. Children who were born healthy often experienced survivor's guilt when their siblings suffered from severe genetic disorders. They knew that their good fortune was purely a matter of genetic chance, and that any children they might have with their own siblings faced similar risks. This knowledge created profound anxiety about reproduction and family planning that affected their entire approach to relationships and parenthood. The development of more sophisticated medical understanding gradually revealed the true scope of genetic damage being caused by sibling reproduction. As physicians began to understand the basic principles of heredity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they started to recognize patterns connecting family marriage practices to genetic disorders. This knowledge remained largely confined to medical circles, as political and religious authorities had powerful incentives to suppress information that undermined their traditional practices. The genetic evidence preserved in historical remains tells a story that contemporary records worked desperately to conceal. Modern DNA analysis of royal burial sites has revealed levels of genetic damage that would be considered catastrophic by contemporary medical standards. Some individuals show evidence of multiple genetic disorders simultaneously, suggesting that their bodies were essentially genetic battlegrounds where numerous harmful recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. The study of these historical genetic disasters has provided modern science with invaluable insights into the mechanisms of genetic disease. Cases that would be impossible to study ethically in controlled research settings are preserved in the archaeological record, allowing researchers to observe the long-term consequences of extreme inbreeding across multiple generations. These natural experiments have helped scientists understand how genetic disorders progress and interact with each other in ways that laboratory studies cannot replicate. The mathematical modeling of genetic decline in inbred populations reveals patterns that are both predictable and terrifying. Computer simulations based on known genetic principles can accurately predict how genetic diversity decreases across generations of sibling reproduction. These models show that even populations that begin with relatively high genetic diversity can collapse into genetic crisis within just a few generations of systematic inbreeding. The role of environmental factors in amplifying the effects of inbreeding adds another dimension to this genetic horror story. Inbred populations often become more susceptible to environmental stresses such as disease outbreaks, nutritional deficiencies, and climate changes. Their reduced genetic diversity leaves them without the biological flexibility needed to adapt to changing conditions, creating a downward spiral where genetic weakness and environmental pressure reinforce each other. The discovery of epigenetic effects has revealed that the consequences of sibling inbreeding can extend beyond simple genetic inheritance. Environmental stresses caused by genetic disorders can trigger changes in gene expression that are then passed on to subsequent generations. This means that the effects of inbreeding can persist and even amplify across generations, even when the original genetic causes are no longer present. Contemporary populations descended from historically inbred communities continue to grapple with these genetic legacies. Some groups have developed sophisticated cultural practices designed to maximize genetic diversity within their reproductive choices. Others have embraced modern genetic testing technology to identify carriers of harmful recessive genes and make informed decisions about family planning. The ethical implications of studying historical inbreeding raise complex questions about privacy, consent, and the use of genetic information. Researchers must balance the scientific value of studying these genetic disasters against the potential harm to contemporary populations who might face discrimination based on their genetic heritage. These considerations have led to the development of new protocols for genetic research that prioritize community consent and cultural sensitivity. The preservation of genetic evidence from inbred populations has become a priority for researchers studying human genetic diversity. As these populations become increasingly integrated with larger gene pools, the opportunity to study the effects of extreme genetic bottlenecks is disappearing. Scientists race against time to document these genetic signatures before they are diluted beyond recognition through outbreeding. The development of gene therapy technologies offers potential hope for addressing some of the genetic disorders that result from historical inbreeding. However, the complexity of treating multiple genetic conditions simultaneously presents enormous technical challenges. Many of the disorders caused by inbreeding involve fundamental developmental processes that cannot be easily corrected after birth. The psychological support systems needed for individuals and families dealing with the consequences of genetic disasters have evolved significantly as our understanding of these conditions has improved. Genetic counselors now work closely with affected families to help them understand their risks, make informed reproductive decisions, and cope with the emotional burden of genetic disease. The cultural impact of understanding inbreeding's genetic consequences has transformed how societies view family relationships and reproductive choices. Traditional practices that once seemed normal or even sacred are now recognized as potentially harmful, leading to complex negotiations between cultural preservation and genetic health. The intersection of genetic science and historical research continues to reveal new aspects of inbreeding's impact on human civilization. Each advance in DNA analysis technology provides new opportunities to study genetic relationships and disease patterns in historical populations. These discoveries often challenge accepted historical narratives and force researchers to reconsider the role of genetic factors in shaping human societies. The global distribution of genetic disorders associated with historical inbreeding provides insights into human migration patterns and population history. Researchers can trace the movement of genetic variants across continents and through time, revealing connections between populations that historical records never documented. The economic burden of caring for individuals with genetic disorders resulting from inbreeding continues to impact healthcare systems worldwide. The complex medical needs of affected individuals require specialized care that can be extremely expensive and difficult to provide. These costs create additional incentives for preventing inbreeding and supporting genetic diversity in human populations. The educational challenges of communicating the risks of inbreeding without stigmatizing affected individuals or communities require careful balance. Public health professionals must provide accurate information about genetic risks while avoiding language that could increase discrimination or social isolation for those dealing with genetic disorders. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey through the shadows of human genetics, we confront a truth that challenges our understanding of power, family, and the very essence of human survival. The horrifying legacy of sibling inbreeding stands as one of history's most devastating testimonies to what happens when human ambition collides with the immutable laws of nature. From the golden corridors of ancient Egyptian palaces to the isolated communities scattered across our modern world, the practice of sibling reproduction has left permanent scars on the human genome. We've witnessed how Charles II of Spain became the final, grotesque embodiment of genetic catastrophe, how Tutankhamun's golden mask concealed a body ravaged by the consequences of his parents' sibling union, and how countless others suffered in silence behind elaborate systems of deception and denial. The mathematics are unforgiving, the science is clear, and the historical evidence is undeniable. When siblings reproduce, they transform genetic diversity, humanity's greatest strength, into a weapon of mass destruction aimed at their own offspring. The 25 to 50% chance of severe genetic abnormalities represents more than mere statistics. These numbers translate into real human suffering that echoes across generations. Yet perhaps the most chilling revelation is that this genetic nightmare continues to unfold in isolated communities today, where geography and circumstance still force impossible choices upon families desperate to survive. The genetic signatures embedded in our DNA serve as permanent reminders that the sins of our ancestors are quite literally written into our very cells. As we close this investigation into one of humanity's darkest genetic secrets, we must remember that knowledge carries responsibility. Understanding the horrifying truth of sibling inbreeding empowers us to prevent future genetic catastrophes while honoring the memory of those who suffered from choices they could not have fully understood. Their legacy lives on in our commitment to genetic diversity, scientific truth, and the fundamental principle that some boundaries should never be crossed.